When I post this on June 5th, it's gonna be my birthday, so consider this a giant gift from me to all of you guys, and thanks so much for your support. As you might know, or maybe you don't, Deepwoken is a hardcore permadeath Roblox game that has the most character diversity that I've ever seen in basically any game, Roblox or not. I'm being real, you can make a build specifically for bombs, potions, and countering with your big brain intelligence, a one-shot assassination build perfect for sneaking up, and even an avatar build with every single element in the entire game. For sure, I'm super biased since I absolutely love this game, but if you want to be creative, Deepwoken is the game for you. What's up guys, it's Punchy, and today we discuss build diversity with a specific focus on weaponry. As I mentioned earlier, creating a character while crafting your special playstyle is very possible in the game of Deepwoken, but we can't forget our weapons. There's a time and place for basically every single option, well most of them, but it's safe to say that all weapons are not made equally. Today I'll be ranking every single weapon in Deepwoken in a tier list setting with a few categories determining their worth. Again, this is just my opinion, but I've had experience for many years with this game. I'm an official Deepwoken game tester and I've tested these weapons, and I'm constantly providing goofy builds and abusable tech for basically every single weapon as well. Of course, take my views with a grain of salt and play the game that you ultimately want to play, but I do think that this ranking can easily inform both inexperienced and veteran players what to try out and what's worth picking. As of right now, this video's content is up to date with the May 31st, 2024 balance patch, and it should hold up fairly well in the future unless drastic changes occurs. Also, I'll put the tier list in the description, so if you want to share your thoughts, comment them down below. Thanks again to Myzron for the super big help. Anyway, let's begin the tier listing. We'll be discussing every single weapon in the current day Deepwoken with their respective class, starting from light weapon all the way to heavy and elemental. Keep in mind, if a weapon does have an alloy, I'll be focusing on the upgraded version instead of the base. Based on this order, we'll also be respecting 4 different weapon categories, of which I'll decide my final ranking of this weapon. First up, number 1 are the competitive stats. How fast does this weapon swing? What's the maximum damage? How does this damage scale? And how many points are required to make this weapon actually usable? It's a pretty objective and basic rating field. Next, gameplay versatility. How often is this weapon performing well? How many situations does it work in? And does this option fall off with the introduction of something else? This is more about what type of gameplay the weapon excels in and where it falls short. Third, we have weapon tech and special attributes. Does this weapon do anything crazy? Are there specific things that we can abuse or change up to our gameplay? And most importantly, how easily can this tech be abused? Instead of just using our weapons normally, we can't just do that, so let's push the limits. The final category is purely subjective, but it's really about how much fun this weapon truly is. This won't make or break where I place a weapon, but I'll definitely mention it if the option is interesting before doing anything else. Regardless of the setting, PvE or against other players, I'll be judging every single Deepwoken weapon based on its capability or potential in the game. And that's about it. To start off our ranking with a tier list breakdown, all the way at the top we have S tier, which is self-explanatory. These weapons perform well while being diverse, unique, and fun. A tier, solid and reliable picks for any type of gameplay, but they just aren't hitting that peak. B tier, decent options that can be useful in a few different situations but aren't as capable as the others. C tier, these weapons exist. Finally, we have D tier. D stands for don't use this weapon. Either it's bad, boring, and useless, whatever it may be, you should probably never pick this up unless you're progressing a build. Underneath this, we have a special category specifically for weapons that could use a rework, buff, or unique crit. Of course, I'll still explain their viability as well, but I wouldn't consider these as great options since they're missing something vital to their kit. Now, without further ado, let's begin ranking every single Deepwoken weapon, starting with Fist. It's time for the first section, light weapons. The Drake Maul gauntlets are a viable endgame fist option introduced exclusively in the Halloween Hollowtide update. With innate bleed and slightly lower than normal swing speed, these gauntlets hit hard and can be used in basically any build that wants the combo. With a fast wind-up critical that ragdolls players, this pick has many combo starters and mantra confirms that just cannot be ignored. Although it is an event-exclusive weapon, the Drake Maul gauntlets place at a solid A tier ranking. Moving on to the Light's final toll. With a surprisingly recent gut, this willpower fist option fell from top tier since it now scales off both light weapon and willpower stats, which basically cut your stat saving in half. This legendary used to be truly powerful, but its expensive stats and well-balanced criticals leave it sitting at a solid C tier placement. It's a fun option, but it kind of just exists alongside stronger picks. Up next, we have the Flamekeeper Cestus. All I gotta say about this pick is that it's the best fist weapon with the best Cestus stats. With a surprisingly low requirement of only 65 light weapon, we hit hard with insanely fast and difficult to read animations, landing the Flamekeeper Cestus at a high S tier ranking. What more do I have to say? It's a fist weapon with very good stats, and fist weapons are some of the best in the game. Moving on to the Anklets of Ulsan. This just create a weapon has much of the same upsides as the Flamekeeper Cestus, but this time we have a crazier fist style that's even weirder. High swing speed and ridiculous animations are a constant with the Just Kurita fighting style, and I forgot to mention that the Anklets have zero requirements while granting Just Kurita builds a free enchant. Quite simply, you can do anything with this weapon, placing it at a high S tier ranking. Next up with the Iron Cestus. Despite this Cestus having very low damage, we do get a great point saving option that doesn't require any light weapon investment. The Iron Cestus functions as a free enchant on any fist style build, which often leads to insane cheese options that can perform well. Again, it's a free enchant while saving some points on extremely diverse builds, so I'll place this at a low to mid-level B tier option. It's still pretty good, and I've even abused this myself. Next up with the Legion Cestus. With a weird point investment and lackluster damage, yeah, you'll get a fist weapon, but there's 0 point in running it on a maxed out build. Seriously, either go all in using the Flamekeeper Cestus or save your points with the Iron Cestus. This drops into the depths as our first D rank rating. Finishing off the fist weapons, we have the Coral Cestus. It's a fairly new weapon with decent stats and a cool new crit which hard knockdowns and can confirm combos. Truth be told, we haven't seen the full potential of this weapon just yet, but I do have some complaints. If this weapon had a fully modifiable range for the jump and critical, I'd probably slap this at an A tier ranking, but for now, it's just a decent pick that can work in B tier. Starting off with the daggers, we have the Stiletto. Not much can be said about a starting dagger with zero requirement and capability to enchant, but it's still a dagger with crazy speed and weird animations. At most, it's used for saving points or sparring with your friends, so I gotta put it down in D tier since there's just better options for dagger. Next up with the Gilded Knife. For some inexplicable reason, the Gilded Knife does way more damage than the Silver Dagger, a more expensive dagger option, and I just don't really know why. Regardless, it's basically a starter option that's unfortunately fodder, so we have to leave it in D tier. Moving on, we have the previously mentioned Silver Dagger. Again, it's almost a carbon copy of other starter daggers, but there's something weird going on. With a higher stat requirement than the Gilded Knife, it does way less damage, so we'll simply place this one spot lower than the Gilded Knife, also in D tier. After this, let's talk about the Knorr Fang. With a surprisingly cool design alongside a decent penetration bonus, I want this weapon to be much more. Unfortunately, there's no point in picking this up since it's just outclassed. This tool is missing a unique critical and doesn't perform well, so I'm just gonna start off our first pick in the needs rework or needs critical category. Next up with the Alloyed Wailing Knife. This dagger is one of the greats, dealing nutty damage with a very fast crit. It's not an understatement to consider this weapon as viable, but sadly it's been thrown to the side by the introduction of the new Cerulean Thread, which takes everything it has and just does it better. I'm placing the Wailing Knife at a high A tier placement. Moving along, we have the Champion's Dagger. This weapon realistically isn't bad, but if you're looking in the strongest category of weapons, there will always be a better pick. It looks cool, but gets easily left behind. Another dagger down in D tier because there's no point in using a weaker option that has nothing special. On to the Central Dirk. I just talked about this dagger, but in summary, it's extremely powerful with a very specific build. As the fastest dagger with the highest range of 7.0, we can do some stupid setups to abuse our hitbox. Alongside Phantom Edge, we're using a Central Dirk with a 7.25 range and the crazy dagger crits, which is insane. With great stats and cheese capability, we'll place the Central Dirk at a mid B tier ranking. Talking about some classics, we now have the Alloy Tonto. It's the other dagger with 7.0 range, but this thing hits hard and snipes players alongside a decent swing speed. It's also worth mentioning mentioning, it's the only dagger with 0-second end lag, which is busted. Unfortunately, I do have to slap the Tonto in a solid A tier position because the Cerulean Thread is just so good, it would be a disservice to place the Tonto at the same level. Moving on to the Nemet Sickle. This dagger has uniquely high penetration with a very low damage. I won't lie, it could use a special unique critical, a range buff, or even an alloy, so I'll just leave it in the needs rework section. Next up, with our first legendary dagger, we have the Flare Blood Kamas. Right off the bat, these things have crazy damage, fast swing speed, and a ranged critical that's nearly unpunishable. Even if you parry this thing, a successful Flare Blood crit can combo into mantras, Manikati at a distance, which cannot be ignored, like it's busted. Although the intelligence investment required could stunt some builds, I gotta place the Flare Blood Kamas at a solid S tier ranking. It's an outstanding weapon that works on many builds. Onto something recently updated, we have the Cerulean Knife, a classic Deepwoken weapon. This option has the potential for greatness with a highly abusable crit with insane versatility. With several tools and tech to harness, if you're really pushing the Cerulean to the maximum, I'd rank this as a low A tier dagger, but if not, it's probably a solid B tier pick. Next up, with the Curse Edge. I won't lie, this dagger is highly consistent, only rivaled by a few different daggers. The damage and pen are solid, great for specific builds that spec into consistent combos and reliable damage. Although it's decent, I'd say it's rivaled by better options like the Alloy Tonto and Cerulean Thread, leaving the Curse Edge at a lower A placement. Finally, the peak of poking, it's time for the Cerulean Thread. With insanely high damage alongside a 25% pen, the Cerulean just outstats every other option. The crit does crazy damage while slumping players and proccing talents, since it simply has double the capability of the Wailing Knife. The Cerulean Thread is a high S tier weapon that works and excels on any endgame dagger build. Starting off the Rapier section with a starter Rapier, we have the Quick Fang. This weapon requires absolutely zero light weapon investment, resulting in a fast Rapier that can be enchanted for specific cheese builds. Surprisingly, it's almost better than the Apprentice Rapier, which is more expensive, but there's little reason to actually use the Quick Fang, so I'ma put it at a D tier ranking. Moving on, I just introduced this option, the Apprentice Rapier. Once again, it's basically a starter option with barely more damage than the Quick Fang, which has no requirement, so it simply falls behind. Don't run this Rapier on your final build. Up next, with the Inquisitor's Rapier. During the introduction of this Rapier, the weapon class itself needed mid-level options to fully integrate into Deepwoken, leaving the Inquisitor's Rapier kinda confused and forgotten. Sadly, it's a progression pick that's vastly outstatted on endgame builds, resulting in a D tier placement. Moving on to the Crucible Rapier. Despite my previous thoughts on mid-level, I guess, filler options, this Rapier isn't that bad. With decent pen and alright damage, all it's really missing is some range to boost it up. Although it's simply okay, 75 light weapon requirement is extremely wasteful and stands as its greatest limitation. I'll place the Crucible Rapier at a solid C tier ranking since it still can be used. Moving on to the newest weapon in Deepwoken, we have the Golden Swordfish, which is basically a joke. With similar stats to the Crucible Rapier, this thing has a really high requirement and kinda falls behind in overall combat. I mean, the critical for this Rapier is exactly the same as the Trident Spear, but that 75 requirement with low stats really drags this weapon down. I'll place this thing in B tier because at least it's special somehow. Up next, with our endgame Rapiers, we have the Cursed Streza. As one of the two final options that many people pick, this thing works well with a solid speed demon build. Although this is a great weapon pick, Rapiers have been nerfed heavily with the removal of multiple enchant procs on crits and posture removal as well. So the Cursed Streza sits nicely as a solid B tier pick. People do use it, but it doesn't stand out in my opinion. Moving on to the last Rapier, the Skull Piercer. This option functions as a consistent Rapier with 100% innate bleed damage and ridiculous range. Although the Cursed Streza can reach greater damage with the use of Speed Demon, the Skull Piercer is easier to use for a less experienced player. Considering what you value more, consistency or max damage, this pick is either one in front or one below the Cursed Streza down in B tier. Starting off our guns, we have the starter option, the Silver Six. Back in the day, this was the go-to pick for builds that wanted an offhand spacing tool. Like seriously, you could proc talents, shoot bullets, and snipe players from a distance distance, but now that's been removed. It's still cool and can be used without a weapon investment, but that won't really save the Silver 6 from its D tier ranking. Next up, we have the Flintlock, a pirate gun that's a classic in my opinion. Much like the previous Silver 6, in theory, you could probably make a cheese build using this weapon, but I don't think it performs well at an endgame level, and you are wasting 20 stat points that could be used on anything. The Flintlock is a D tier pistol and shouldn't be used on your final build. Finally, onto something decent, we have the revolvers. No matter what type of gun style you're playing with, this is one of the highest DPS options in the entire game. I'm not gonna lie, guns are pretty insane with their projectile shots, and for some reason, the revolver itself has 12 range. All revolvers benefit from bullet pen, pen talent, damage multipliers, and spacing, putting this endgame weapon at a solid A tier placement. It's fast and reliable on any gun build. Next up, with the Dragoon. I'll be honest, this weapon is interchangeable with the revolver with slightly adjusted stats. With more damage and slower firing speed, it hits hard, but it does have a little bit less overall DPS. Again, it's not gonna make or break your build unless you got something very specific going on, so I'll slap this right next to the revolvers at a solid A tier ranking. Moving on to something new, we have the Alloy Dawn Shot. I'm not gonna lie, this is very similar to the revolver and performs well in basically the same situations. The stats are kinda negligible, but it is worth mentioning that this gun is very big, so maybe you like this. Design-wise, I prefer this more than the revolver, but it stands right next to it in the weapon placement at A tier. Starting off the medium weapon class with the summer rifle, let's continue with that gun theme. So this rifle is a solid starter option with low requirements and some decent damage. The great pressure and high range for this weapon subclass remains as some of the best, but specifically the summer rifle isn't anything crazy. It exists and does its job correctly, leaving the summer rifle at a mid-level C ranking. Moving on to a direct upgrade from the previous pick, we have the Rosen's rifle. With higher stats and better critical usage, this is the definitive rifle weapon for any endgame build. The weapon itself will always outrange other options, but the Rosen's rifle doesn't even need bullets to shoot projectiles. So anyway, it's a great weapon that deserves a solid A tier placement. Another endgame rifle is the Iron Blunderbuss. The only thing different about this option is the innate penetration stat, and I'd say it's only gotten better over the ages. With the removal of M1 bullets, the Blunderbuss has crazy potential for cheese with specific maxed out pen builds, and it can still be one of the heaviest hitting weapons in the entire game. The Iron Blunderbuss gets an A tier placement. Starting with the medium sword category, we have our basic sword, the most well-rounded starter option in the entire game. Everyone basically learned combat with this weapon. With a decent crit that deals high posture damage and consistent swing speed, it's a great tool to start with, but falls off very quickly in endgame content. D tier placement, there's always better options for your build. Now, onto the Alloyed Messer. This weapon is really weird, but it's not even that bad. I'd say this pick does decent damage, but its slow swing speed and unoptimal performance are outclassed by basically every single other medium weapon. There's no real reason to use the Alloyed Messer with very little tech to play around with, so it's stuck at C tier. Next up, with the Alloyed Falchion, a forgotten weapon that was nerfed into the ground. Although it's a fast swinging medium, it's simply outstatted by faster weapons that deal more damage for no downside. Rapiers and even the Forgotten Gladius are just better, so why even run this? I'll put this at C tier since it just exists and I have used it before. With yet another weird weapon, we have the Scimitar, a notorious option for insanely min-maxed builds. The Scimitar is a very powerful and almost meta pick. With low weapon requirement, fast swing speed, enchant, and access to the medium talent Stronghold, this option surprisingly isn't even that bad. Players will use this often to swing fast while saving so many stats, and it can be very good. I'll rate the Scimitar as a solid to high B tier placement, but unfortunately, I hate the model for this weapon. Onto the Alloy Katana, and this time also the regular Katana. One of the most consistent weapons in all of Deepwoken, the Katana serves its purpose as a high pressure mantra stacking option that's great for ganks. With synergy with a ton of different builds, you can use this weapon without cheesing players players and still perform well. Specifically for the katana, without the alloy, damage isn't really an issue if you're using the paired soul armor talent, and players will often use this to save stats. This isn't even the surface of what the katana can do, but I'll slap this with a solid A tier ranking. Next up, with the Worshipper Longsword. Nobody that I know in the entire game unironically uses this, but maybe you know somebody that does, I don't know. So yeah, the stats are nothing special and falls behind easily, and it even looks way too similar to the Vigil Longsword, which has better stats. If this weapon was removed, nobody would even know, so be lucky I'm putting this at a sad C tier ranking. Next up, I'm gonna bring up two weapons right now because they're basically in the same exact situation. Both the Officer Saber and the Cavalry Saber suffer from the same design and same issue. I won't deny, each of these options looks exactly the same and are just kinda mid, but they do deserve something better. Both sabers could use a custom crit, alloy, or something else, but they could be so much more. Both of these sabers go down below in the needs rework section. Onto a classic, we have the alloyed Vigil Longsword. This weapon does pretty good damage and was recently buffed, but it's essentially a basic stat stick. There's nothing unique about this pick, but I really enjoy its simple but knightly sword model. I'd say all it needs is a special crit, but the Vigil Longsword just exists in C tier placement. Up next, with the Champion Sword, right alongside the Scimitar, a lot of players recently were using this option to save points and deal decent damage. Due to the enchant scaling nerfs relying on damage dealt, it's okay, but there are better options for sure. The Champion Sword remains at a mid B ranking. Moving on to the Alloyed Shuttle. This weapon is very unique with high damage and a special crit. With the ability to deal nice chip damage on a crit attack, it's good for dealing, I guess, block pressure, but it's really hard to hit. I think there is potential for fun cheese builds that take advantage of its attributes, but right now the critical is too difficult to land, so I'ma place the Alloyed Shuttle at a high C ranking. With a crazy option, we move forwards onto the Warden Ceremonial Sword. This pick is an extremely fun medium weapon that has so much movement tech and possibility with the new multi-hitting crit. The speed is great, the damage is solid, and it only requires 50 medium, which is awesome for saving points. It's one of the best and also one of my favorite weapons, placing the Warden Ceremonial Sword at a solid A tier ranking. Bringing back another classic Deepwoken weapon, we have the Razor's Cutlass. Although this weapon is kinda slow, it was one of the first bleed weapons and remains as one of the highest DPS mediums in the entire game. The stats are great, but I do think it needs a special crit. Normally I'd place this in B tier or something around C tier, but for now I think the rework section is probably the best spot. Onto something new, we have the Wormtooth Hybrid Weapon. With a mix of both heavy and medium, there's a lot that can be done with this weapon. With nice mobility and crits that feel smooth and confirm high damage, I think this weapon is very good in a majority of all Deepwoken gameplay. Although I wish the Wormtooth could use heavy weapon talents, it sits safely in S tier ranking because it's so diverse and excels above other picks. Revisiting some classics, it's time for the Forgotten Gladius. Living up to its name, the Gladius is truly forgotten, simply outstatted by other options. Its swing speed seems decent and it's definitely a balanced option, but I think it's too cool to not have a special crit, so let's put it in the needs rework category. Moving on to one of my favorite weapons in the game, we have the Serpent's Edge. This option is a classic that's known for its outstanding damage and notoriously strange crit. I wouldn't consider this option as top tier, but I think all it needs is a cancel option for the crit, and that will make it so much better. It definitely has a place in certain builds and excels for running in water, solidifying its spot in B tier. Next up, we're back with even more Hollow-Tide weapons with the Hollow's Cleave. This medium is a cool looking pumpkin sword with almost identical stats to the Shattered Katana. Although it is so similar, its gameplay is too basic, in desperate need for a special crit. Seriously though, how can this pumpkin sword not have a pumpkin crit? I'ma put this in the rework category. Moving on, we have the Curse Blade. One of the best endgame options, the Curse Blade remains as a high damage, high posture weapon alongside some good chip as well. This sword is the dictionary definition of consistency and combos well with many enchants for even more block pressure. The Curse Blade gets a solid A tier placement, but it's kinda boring. With some crazy new weapons, we also have the Purple Cloud. Effectively a fist weapon, we have a sword with insane animations, a roll catch and crit with some fast paced diverse build combos. I wouldn't consider this weapon that competitively viable, but it is very useful in more situations than one. The Purple Cloud receives a simple S tier rating for its versatility and unique attributes that definitely make it stand apart. Finishing off the medium sword category, it's about time for the Shattered Katana. A Deepwoken classic, this sword is much more than just a stat stick. With a ton of confirmable options with the Shattered Katana crit, solid enchants, and viability with the Poser's Ring, it's a versatile option that is very fun to run. Solid S tier ranking for the Shattered Katana. Beginning the medium spear category, we have two weapons that are practically the same, the Iron Tusk and Iron Spear. By comparing the stats, not much has actually changed, but they basically serve the same purpose. Similar to the Iron Cestus, many players run this spear to min-max mantra builds while getting a free enchant alongside the crazy default spear crit. I consider both of these C tier options because I've seen it work if used exclusively for cheese builds. Next up, with the Alloyed Gromorian Long Spear, this thing is very weird. Previously a fun option, the critical on this weapon is very techy if used correctly. We can definitely pull people around, but the targeting feels odd. Besides this, the Alloyed Gromorian Long Spear is simply outclassed by Great Spears stat-wise, leaving it behind in C tier. Moving on to the Ritual Spear. As I made this script, I almost forgot about this weapon's existence because it really serves zero purpose. With a nearly identical design to the Gromorian Long Spear, it's a lackluster weapon that does not have a purpose on endgame builds. The Ritual Spear is D tier and there's no reason to run this ever. Up next, with our near endgame spears, we have the Archon's War Spear. This weapon's stats are fairly low compared to other spears, resulting in great gank builds that invest in other areas besides weapon. It's a good, consistent spear that's flexible, earning the Archon's War Spear a high tier A ranking. Following this, we have the legendary Imperial Staff. Technically classified as a spear, this staff has extremely good stats, hard to read animations, and several different crits that remain as some of the best in the entire game. You don't even need that much strength to run this, allowing for fun builds and cool confirmable combos, earning the Imperial Staff an easy S tier ranking. Continuing our discussion about new content, let's talk about the Alloyed Trident Spear. This thing hits hard with decent stats, but it's defined by its linear charge critical. Although this option lacks tech, its crazy movement and roll catching capability, especially in lag, grant this trident all it needs to perform well. Honestly, I'm biased and love this weapon, so I'm placing this in mid-level A tier. Onto the Serrated War Spear. This spear is a consistent bleed weapon that does very high damage, and for some reason, if you have the same amount of stats, it actually outclasses the Kurzglaive endgame spear, which is weird. So yeah, it's just equal, if not better, than the Kurzglaive. The Serrated War Spear gets a high B or low A tier ranking for being weird, yet solid. Alongside the War Spear, I guess it's time to talk about the Kurzglaive. This spear is a very consistent weapon with innate bleed that hits hard, but not as hard as the Serrated War Spear. So trust me, it's very good, but that single interaction keeps it at the same tier, right next to the War Spear. Back with yet another Hollow-Tide weapon, we have the Blood-Tide Trident. I think this weapon could be crazy, and it definitely benefits due to its very weird crit. The M1 stats are decent, but the crit that snipes players and brings them close is probably one of the most fun and wacky things that I've ever seen in Deepwoken. There's a few insane confirmable combos with this weapon that I discussed in a recent video, so I think the Blood-Tide Trident exists in the A tier rank. Next up, with the Rifle Spear. A lot of players sleep on this weapon, and it even surprised me when I saw its full potential. With outstanding damage alongside a range crit that confirms mantras, the Rifle Spear excels in its category as a valid poking tool. There's definitely a learning curve with this pick, but I think it deserves its A tier placement. Finishing off the spear category with, in my opinion, the best option, we have the True Seraph Spear. Spears as a whole are very solid in the current PvP meta, and the True Seraph Spear swings fast and outdamages all the rest with optimal speed demon usage. For an inexperienced player, this isn't the spear you should be using, but for maximum potential, the True Seraph Spear reaches the peak of Deepwoken weapons. The True Seraph Spear safely secures its place in S tier. Starting off the club category, we have the Mace. This one's the starter mace that one-shots block with solid blunt damage, and there's nothing much else to say, leaving the Mace down in D tier. I'll save some time with this rating, but the new mid-level Tooth Club and Morningstar have basically the same purpose and I guess ranking. As the filler progression level clubs, there are always going to be better options options, but both of these maces have innate bleed while simply outclassing other swords with the same requirements. I consider these better than most weapons in all of Deepwoken alongside their hard-hitting crits, so both these mid-level clubs remain at a solid A tier placement. Up next, we have the Sacred Hammer, the definitive hammer pick for early game Deepwoken. This thing works well and reaches high damage with the use of Speed Demon. It's another solid pick and very deserving of an A tier ranking. Finishing up the club category as well as all regular mediums, we have the new Pernok Club. This is the essential stat stick of maces, dealing very high damage with bleed at the top of the entire weapon class. The guard break critical is decent in the current Deepwoken meta, and the talents are also very valid, so this is a solid to high A tier ranking for the Pernok. Now, let's begin with the heavy weapons with our starter Battle Axe. Throughout your progression, this weapon is great for damage, consistently breaking blocks, free enchants, and the heavy uppercut is exactly what it needs to be. It's a good pick for building your character, but clearly outstatted in endgame, leaving the Battle Axe behind in D tier. On to the next with the Alloyed Halberd. I absolutely love this weapon's critical mobility and decently fast swing speed. In a world of slow options, the Halberd moves quickly with 0 M1 end lag, bridging the gap between slow heavy weapons and mediums. The Halberd sits safely in a solid A tier placement. Moving on to the Alloyed Aggression Axe, a personal favorite weapon of mine. Since the Aggression Axe has super fast swing speed, it's very easy to take advantage of the viable but normal heavy crit. Alongside some wind gems and movement mantras, I think this weapon can really work. It's decent if you know what you're doing, so I'll place the Aggression Axe in a B tier placement. Mixing it up with a weird choice, we have the Alloyed Canorian Axe. I'll be honest, there's not really much going on here with this axe's slower swing speed, and I'd rather pick something else. I think the Canorian Axe deserves better within the possible rework or critical section. Moving along, we have the Iron Birch. Surprisingly, this weapon isn't very strong. It doesn't have an alloy, it has really bad posture and mid damage, but the cool part comes into play with its 0 end lag. It's an okay weapon, but I wouldn't use this if you're looking for gameplay diversity. The Iron Birch gets slammed into C tier. Finally, we're back with the classic, the Evan Spears Hand Axe. Believe it or not, this thing is the pure icon for PvE, dealing the most damage out of any heavy weapon and probably weapon in the entire game. In theory, you could probably one-shot players with the Evan Spear Axe, and we already know it's the peak of monster hunting. The Evan Spear Hand Axe earns its position up in S tier for very self-explanatory reasons. Next up, we have the Night Axe. Despite its pretty cool name, the only unique attribute of this weapon is its ungodly chip damage. With the highest chip damage in the entire game, we can seriously hit hard against blocking players, but then, once again, just use the Stone enchant if you want to do better. Sadly, I'm gonna throw this in C tier. After this, let's discuss the Master Hawk's Hand Axe. Suffering from many of the same issues as the filler mid-level Greataxes, there's nothing really build-defining about this weapon. Although it kinda just exists, nobody really picks it up unless they're going for drip, so the Master Hawk's Hand Axe places in C tier. Recently updated, we also have the Relic Axe. This axe has a very special crit that has possible mantra confirms and a whole lot of cheese. Although I don't think its potential has really been showcased by a really good player, I think there are options for very specific playstyles that can work. I'll rank the Relic Axe as B tier because it is something different that can actually work. Back to the classics, we have the Enforcer Axe. Performing well in both PvE and PvP, this weapon and its crit are very hard to parry with insane damage. If people sleep on this option, watch out for it because it hits hard and synergizes with a bunch of playstyles, so solid B tier placement for the Enforcer Axe. After this, we have the Skyreap Blade, another crazy Hollowtide weapon and the only Deepwoken scythe. This thing is really cool. The animations are weird and hard to deal with, but our damage is low alongside unexpected end lag, so I'd love to see a special crit and the removal of end lag, but until then, it's stuck in B tier. With a fairly new weapon, we have the Pale Briar. This Greataxe is kind of crazy with its huge AoE crit which procs enchants and stun players, topped off with ridiculous posture damage. If you're playing PvE or simply cheesing players in PvP, there's a ton of gameplay diversity with the Pale Briar. I'll place this in S tier because we can truly do a lot with this weapon. Starting off with our Greatswords, let's discuss the Avenger. A zero-cost, enchantable greatsword isn't really that bad, but why not use the battle axe? Sorry to say it, but the Avenger stays in D tier on endgame level builds. Up next, we got the Alloyed Zweihander. Although basic, this thing hits hard with great range and solid posture damage. Roll stacking with this option is pretty viable on many different builds, landing the Zweihander a solid ranking in B tier. Moving on, we have a very weird weapon, the Alloyed Markor's Inheritor. With fully normal greatsword M1s alongside a strange Neve crit, I want this weapon to be good, but it just isn't that good. The critical definitely doesn't hold up to a normal greatsword crit, so why wouldn't you just want that? I do know there are possible builds that abuse this weapon, but there's clearly better options that serve the same purpose. For now, the Markor's Inheritor kind of just exists, leaving it down in a C tier placement. Going further, let's mention the Alloyed Crescent Cleaver. This weapon has its own special place in certain builds with decent damage and a cool slam down crit, but it's immediately blown out of the water by the Curse Cleave, a direct upgrade. Sticking with the C theme, the Crescent Cleaver goes down in C tier. Next up, with the classic Deepwoken hitter, we got the Dark Steel or Dark Alloy Greatsword. With high damage M1s and a full hyper armor critical, this functions as a get out of jail free card and a free vent. If I'm being honest, the Dark Steel Greatsword needs some sort of competency and game experience to use effectively, but it is good alongside the heavy uppercut mix. This places fairly high with a solid A tier placement. Moving on to the Inquisitor's Straight Sword. There's really not too much to say about this weapon, but it's a fast greatsword option that doesn't require that many points. With a good status enchant, this thing slaps, but I'd say it's valid, leaving this weapon in B tier. A weird new legendary option, we have the Curse Seeger. To be fair, this weapon works very well with a solid chargeable laser beam and 0 end lag M1s. There's basically infinite cheese potential that can lead or set up charge beams, and that's really fun. I think it's a cool pick, but the charisma proc on crit and charisma requirements hold back this weapon from being really nice. Like, why does it even need this? The Curse Seeger is restricted and held back into A tier because of that wasted charisma. Onto a fan favorite, we have the First Light. This greatsword is truly special, more unique than a few actual legendary options. With a near unavoidable annoying crit, crazy new animations, and a sick enchantable design, I can't lie, this greatsword has a lot going for it. For now, I'll place this in a mid-level A tier since I think the crit cooldown needs to be a little bit lower. Now, let's talk about the Curse Cleave, a direct upgrade to the Crescent Cleaver. This weapon has an S tier competitive viability as a greatsword, but only with a few different builds. Yes, it performs well with a few enchant combos, but those specific playstyles kill the build diversity of this weapon. Although its stats are simply overtuned, you only really see this with the Nemesis enchant or other cheese options. I'll rate the Curse Cleave as an A tier option because it's only used with the same few builds. Next up, we have the Railblade, a truly special greatsword. After a few different balance changes, the Railblade's multiple crits fell a bit lower with the bonus upside of enchant, but there's so much that we can do with this weapon. Mantra combos work, crit confirms work, enchants work, and it also does decent damage. Although its competitive viability isn't the top of the top, it works with almost any playstyle and build, resulting in a final S tier placement. Finishing off the greatsword category, we have the Enforcer Greatsword. This pick is pretty nice with decently fast swing speed, a good spinning crit, and 0 end lag on your swings. Sure, it's pretty fun, but its high stat requirements can really hurt your build, so if I'm being honest, just use the Railblade instead if you want a fast option. The Enforcer Greatsword is placed with a B tier ranking. Beginning the Greathammer category, we finally have the Alloyed Steel Maul. To be fair, this hammer is a filler option, so it has to be kinda mid. The stats realistically aren't that bad, but it also won't make or break your build, and it's boring. It's a solid pick that works, earning a B tier placement. Once again, with the filler options that don't do anything special, we have a cool looking one, the Forge Greathammer. Seriously, this weapon looks crazy, but its stats are underwhelming and it's overall just a forgotten option. This exists and that's about it, leaving it down below in C tier. Mixing it up with a cool mob drop, we have the Great Maul. Being a giant hammer that hits hard, we got some solid stats alongside a really cool appearance. I'm kinda sad there's little to no tech that we can abuse with this golem drop, but I think it deserves a place right next to the Steel Maul at B tier. Moving on to the Pale Morning, a Deepwoken classic weapon. This weapon is simply good good with decent stats and a hard-hitting crit. To be honest, I'd prefer if this option had its own special critical, but without it, it's still a B tier or A tier weapon based off the stats, and it also works on many builds. Finishing off all the Hollowtide weapons, we have the Putrid Eden Staff Greathammer. This weapon has a sick design with a very weird ranged crit that knocks players down and snipes them. Besides this, it also procs enchants from a distance, and I definitely feel like a mage weapon like this should be more magey and have lower requirements. The Putrid Eden Staff certainly isn't bad, solidifying its rank as a B tier weapon, but the requirements are a bit too high for me to use. You know I had to say it, it's time for the Petra's Anchor. This hammer is one of the greatest with a fast, unique startup crit that does ridiculous damage and sends players flying. There's so much capability with the movement alone, but the high damage and decent posture make it one of the best. Petra's Anchor easily fits at the top with an S tier ranking. Moving on to the new Sovereign's Punishment. Since it's a giant hammer, this thing is a true slow stat stick. It's very slow but hits hard and could use a special critical. I'll place this at B tier since build diversity is just an option for the Sovereign's Punishment. Next up with the Enforcer Hammer. I won't lie, these stats are very similar to the original Enforcer Axe, but it sacrifices hit damage for extended posture pressure. I consider this tied up with the OG, slapping it right next to the axe at a solid B tier spot. Another golem weapon, we have the Stoneheart. It's worth mentioning that this weapon deals insane posture and damage on hit, but it gets even better against better players. When fighting those who don't predict parry or just parry because they want to, the Stoneheart gets kinda slapped, but reactionary players that wait and try to react, they get hit very hard by the Stoneheart. Also, the crit is special with a pretty cool learning curve, so I'll put the Stoneheart at a solid A tier placement if you know what you're doing. With the final heavy weapon, we got the Hive Lord's Hubris. Okay, this weapon swings slow, very slow, and it's basically only used alongside the Heavy Hands ring. I won't lie, it's very boring and funny to play for about 10 minutes, but build diversity with this weapon is practically non-existent. I'll put this in B tier because it can work well, but that's about it. Now, it's time for the final section of our tier list, the entire legendary elemental section. There's a bit to discuss, but I'll try to keep it brief, and let's begin. Starting off with the Ignition Deep Crusher, there's a few things holding this weapon back. A lot of people forget that this weapon is 2-in-1. The stronger two-handed hammer places rods on hit, and the faster sword doesn't place rods, so why are we using this? I'll be honest, there's almost no reason to use the sword variant of the Deep Crusher, and the easy to counter crit doesn't really help its case. Although its stat requirements drop significantly, the Ignition Deep Crusher still feels like half a weapon and is just kinda boring. Slapping this down in B tier since it works decently in different builds. In contrast, we have a great weapon, the Curved Blade of Winds. This sword has so much capability with setups, combos with multiple crits, proccing multiple attunement talents with varying playstyles as well. The Curved Blade of Winds works with a ton of setups and performs well too, placing it at an S tier rating, and that's all I gotta say. It's just very good. After that, we have the Storm's Eye. This rifle isn't exactly a rifle and shouldn't really be considered as one because it has insane pressure up close. With insane rushdown capability with a broken M1 hitbox, ridiculous flourish range, air teleport, and iframe crit, abusing this weapon isn't difficult to do. S stands for Storm's Eye, and it definitely belongs in this category for its build diversity alone. Onto a crazy pick, we got the Crypt Blade. This weapon works well in almost any situation with cheese builds, hybrid combos, solid shadow lockdown, or basically anything. The Crypt Blade excels in almost all builds that have a simple combo piece with its critical or shadow steal, and that's enough to place it at a high S tier ranking. After this, we have the Grand Sudaruska. This axe has some solid damage with a ridiculous crit hitbox and multiple techie options. There's a ton of different mantra combos that set up solid crit play, and it's also not really a bad pick. Besides this, I think that build diversity with this weapon is also kind of fairly limited with a few different options, but we see a lot of the same. Personally, I'd love to see crazier builds with this weapon, but it doesn't stand up that, comparatively to the Crypt or Curved Blade. The Grand Sudaruska is great, leaving it at a mid-level A tier placement. Next up, we got the Isley's Pyre Keeper. I'll be honest, this weapon can do absolutely anything, proccing flame on hit, triggering every single flame talent, and of course it has 5 different crits with hyper armor, for basically any situation. The performance and build diversity with this weapon is something insane and and basically cannot be downplayed. So yeah, I gotta put the Isleys as an S tier weapon. Now, for the final rating of all Deepwoken weapons, I'll be discussing, I guess, all of the hero blades in a single section. It's without overestimating that each hero blade excels in full elemental mage builds and works very well with specialized hybrid element options as well. Although each attunement has an area of expertise with their specific crits, I think it's safe to say that each weapon has a time and place for usage and I guess is solid in A tier. Also in the future, I believe hero blades will have a big use in the Saint Sworn Hero Blade Oath, so keep an eye out for that. And that's about everything. We're finally finished with the entire Deepwoken weapon ranking based on my criteria, and that seriously took a while. Seriously, this was way harder than expected, and hopefully this helps you out. If you learned something new or thought this was helpful, make sure to like and subscribe, and please comment your thoughts down below about a weapon that you like or maybe something I missed. As always, make sure to like and subscribe because I'm trying to hit 85k subs. Thanks again, it's punchin' time.